I would like to introduce you to today's presenter, Jim Patton. Jim attended Indiana University and is a seasoned learning leader with 19 years of experience in training and organizational change management and account management. Jim is passionate about helping his clients' employees thrive in their work, whether it be helping B2B sales representatives have more effective sales conversations or working with IT managers to have productive coaching conversations with their employees. Jim works with his clients to focus on identifying the outcomes employees need to produce in their role and leverages that as the design point to create a more streamlined learning and development plan that is focused on what really matters to drive business impact. With that, Jim, I'm going to give you presenter rights to kick off the presentation.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you everyone for joining today. Before I dive into an overview of the agenda, I thought it important to point out why I came up with the title for this webinar, Don't Sell to Your Customers, Listen to Them. I've been in the selling in the B2B space now for about 12 years, and over the last few years, things have changed drastically. In the past, I would show up and talk to my customers and tell them all about me and the wonderful products and services that my company offered. I used to, in meetings, ask customers, what keeps you up at night? What are your pain points? And I would used to then go into a deep dive on my company, the products and services I had, and then ask, hey, is there a match? I like to call that now, in hindsight, the match game. And that's how a lot of folks sold, prior to the last few years, with a focus on, I'm going to explain all my services and capabilities. Now you tell me all your pain points, and let's see if there's a connection and we're having a further discussion. But times have changed, and we'll talk about that today, and how customers now are looking for an account executive, business sales rep to show up that knows about them, that has a point of view on business challenges that they're facing, and already knows what some of those questions are and has the answers to them that in the past they would be asking before they ever begin talking about their goods and services. So as we look at the agenda, I'm going to talk a little bit about some trends in the marketplace that we're seeing, and then I'm going to talk about a 5-step process to have more effective sales conversations with your customers, and that's where the listening piece comes in. I'm going to talk about sharing a tailored point of view, connecting with the right buyer, how do you set up a successful meeting, and what are the components of a successful meeting. How do you go about establishing a shared definition of success with all the stakeholders, both on the customer side and on the selling side? And then how do you make the value tangible to the customer? And then finally, I'll wrap up with a case study and a few points to remember, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. But before we get started in terms of me talking about some of the trends, I'd like to open up a poll. And so just to make sure that we get us engaged on the topic at hand. So here's the poll question. According to Forrester Research, what percentage of buyers know what they want before they even contact a vendor? So again, we'll open up the poll. You should see the poll there in the WebEx. And again, according to Forrester Research, what percentage of buyers know what they want even before they contact a vendor? And you can see your choices there are A, 20%, B, 40%, C, 60%, or D, 80%. So go ahead and make your selection, and we'll keep this open for a few moments here.
Yep, the answers are coming in now, and so we'll give it about 20 more seconds for folks to go ahead and input their answers. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to, please make sure to input your answers, and we'll go ahead and close the poll shortly.
Okay, so and let's see what we come back with. So fairly even distribution, so that's interesting. We see 15, 20, 35%, and 30%. And according to Forrester, the actual answer to that is 80%, and that number has risen in the last couple years. 80% of buyers know what they want even before they contact a vendor. And so that even puts more emphasis on the sales conversation approach that I'm going to be discussing today. Before I dive into the approach, I'm going to share a little bit about what we're seeing in the marketplace, and you've had folks have probably seen some of these similar things in your own workplace. First, the growth of inside sales as a profession has outpaced that of field sales 15-to-1 in the last 3 years. We're seeing a lot more of that due to digital technology, social selling, A lot of companies now, the folks that they're hiring for inside sales position bring the same qualifications that maybe the field sales folks brought in the past, but now they're doing this from an inside sales perspective as well. Buyers are now desensitized to standard sales tactics and messages and channels. So the way I used to go to market a few years back, that doesn't work anymore. There's no more of, hey, what keeps you up at night, or what are your pain points? It's more difficult to get in through a cold call. It's more difficult to send an email and get a meeting. So again, the importance of the emphasis on having effective conversations once you finally get through to a buyer. Buyers are engaging via digital channels. That goes back to our poll question. The buyer knows more about the seller than they ever have before when the seller shows up, and that wasn't the case just a few years back. And then Forrester also talks about 4 different types of selling roles, and their research shows that by the year 2020, consultants, one of the categories, those that are consultative sellers, will be coveted and make up 62% of the sales force. So in comparison, to give you an example, one of those other selling types is an order taker, and there will be less need for the order taker and more need for the consultative seller. And then just a few more trends. We're also seeing in the business-to-business sales force, Forrester projects that the the sales force for business-to-business will decrease by 1 million people by 2020. So folks in jobs like mine, if I don't move on and get away from the way I used to try to sell and don't become more of an effective sales conversation seller, could create a problem for me and my job being in jeopardy over time. Senior executives are underwhelmed with the interactions they see with their salespeople. Some of their comments are they see salespeople showing up that are unprepared, don't know their business, can't answer questions. And then go-to-market leaders must commit to arming their sales force with the knowledge, the tools, and the confidence to succeed with today's B2B buyer. And they can do this by having effective sales conversations. So this slide here shows what I like to call a journey for having these effective sales conversations. We're going to dive into each step along the way in this journey, but first we're going to talk about sharing a tailored point of view and how do you gain insights about the buyer before you even have had a conversation with him or her. Secondly, connecting with the right buyer, trying to determine who's the appropriate audience, how do I approach this buyer, am I going deep enough in the organization, am I going high enough? Third, once I've been able to develop my tailored point of view and connected with the right buyer, how do you go about having a successful meeting? How do you make sure that you show up and are prepared and can talk about the buyer's business and can answer his or her questions to having an organized meeting structure? Fourth, once you're in that meeting, how do you go about establishing a shared definition of success and getting alignment with the many stakeholders on the problem and solution? A lot more stakeholders involved, again, both on the selling side and on the buying side than there have been in the past. And then finally, how do you make the value tangible? How do you create an appealing business story so that the stakeholders in the buying organization can go back and talk to others about your point of view and what you're trying to sell before you ever get to closing a sale? And that's the other thing we've seen too now, that in order to have an effective conversation, sometimes you're doing this more than once. You're going through this in a series of iterations before you ever close the deal, again, depending upon what industry you're working in. So now I want to dive into each step along the way along this journey. And the first one is around sharing a tailored point of view. A prepared sales professional needs to present a tailored point of view for and to a given customer. So the sales reps need to learn how do they gain insights about the buyer from research and how do they craft a problem-centric point of view. It needs to be tailored to what matters most to the customers. And this can be done a number of ways by assessing the customer's business issues and the customer's pressures and trends before the meeting. So in the past, where I might have gone to a meeting years ago and said, hey, what are some of your pain points? What are some of your business issues? The buyers, depending upon me to have done my research and come prepared to bring those up to him or her. I'm going to learn some things in the conversation along the way, but I better have done my homework and prepared before I got there. Sources, many sources available to gain this insight. You can gain it through the company website for the buyer that you're presenting to, through annual reports, publications such as Hoover's and Inside View, the Wall Street Journal. Then you develop your point of view on how you can help your customers solve their business problems with your products and services. So now this is where you start to make that link. need to be relevant, and the point of view needs to be compelling. Now you've established that tailored point of view, it's time to connect with the right buyer and determine who that is. A prepared sales professional needs to identify the appropriate buyer or buyers and initiate relationships with them. Often what we find is that buyers don't go, or sellers don't go high enough in an organization, so maybe they're trying to get into an organization to sell their good or service, and they maybe aren't dealing high enough, maybe need to be higher up in more in the C-level, depending upon, again, your goods or service. They're not going wide enough, so once they've gotten into an organization, they're missing out on opportunities to go to other parts of the organization, and oftentimes aren't going deep enough within the target organization. So maybe there's other opportunities to continue to sell further products and services to the person who's maybe bought from you initially. It's important here to be able to link the tailored point of view to the right buyer. And in order to do that, you need to determine what are the business issues that each buyer brings to the table, not your specific services, but what are the business issues, and then being able to attach those services to that in a conversation. And then determining who cares about, your capabilities and how you solve business problems so that you can get to the right person. So again, you need to make sure you have the right audience, the right message, places to go to be able to do this. LinkedIn has become very big and popular to do that. You can also find out who the buyers are through trade shows, marketing campaigns, annual reports, news articles. Pay attention to what's going on in the industries you serve and see where there's transformation or business change taking place. So now you've tailored the point of view, you've connected with the right buyer, you're ready to have your meeting. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of being prepared. The days of showing up with, okay, I know I'm meeting with Steve Smith and I know Steve Smith's role, and I'll just ask a bunch of questions when I get there to try to determine what Steve's needs are over. A prepared sales professional needs to be able to facilitate a successful meeting. They need to, besides prepare, listen. So in that meeting, in the past, maybe I would have opened up and talking about me and my services and capabilities. Now I open those meetings up with the customer telling me about his or her challenges and me being able to have an intelligent conversation with him or her due to the homework I've done. And in fact, in my own case, I often don't even take a presentation with me. I have one in case I need to draw upon it, but I really want to learn more about that buyer as much as I can in that initial meeting, and then maybe come back in the second round and say, okay, now let me present my point of view that we've discussed in the initial meeting in a little bit more detail. Ahead of time, it's important to define what a successful meeting looks like. And again, you're not always going to get a sale. That doesn't always determine success at the end of the first meeting. And make sure you have a meeting agenda and objectives set up ahead of time. So we've developed the tailored point of view, found the right buyer. Now we're in the meeting, and as part of the successful meeting, you need to be able to establish a shared definition of success with the buyer. A prepared sales professional can align multiple perspectives, define the problem, and align others around a singular solution. And as I mentioned earlier, there are so many people involved in the buying decision these days, both from the customer side and the selling side. On the seller side, you often have operations folks, legal folks that are playing a role and giving input, folks from the finance side. And then on the buying side, not only do you have maybe the buyer that you're working with, but you also involves procurement often, legal folks and finance folks as well. So many more stakeholders than maybe what was involved in a buying process just a decade ago. Know ahead of time who the meeting attendees are, and know what their needs are and what their priorities are. And then during the meeting, begin to select the defined outcome and determine the unified action that both sides are going to take once the meeting's over, and try to gain the client support. Again, the goal here as part of the meeting is to achieve this shared definition of success going forward. And then finally, the fifth step is making the value tangible. A prepared sales professional will have the ability to tell a memorable, credible, and really importantly, emotionally appealing story that presents the solution. And we're seeing a lot of use of story in the selling field now, trying to draw upon people's feelings and understanding of something and not just the business facts around it. The story needs to be relevant to the buyer's needs, and it needs to appeal to the buyer's emotions. It's got to be something they can share with other stakeholders who are part of the business process, because oftentimes not all the stakeholders are in the room at the same time. And it's good often to be able to include client testimonials when sharing the story and trying to make the value tangible. And in the few minutes that I have left, I'd like to talk a little bit about a case study that I was a part of with the customer's a credit bureau agency, and their business need was they were transforming their global sales force to support client growth strategies as a risk information solutions provider. They had a study done by McKinsey that said they needed to, gave some recommendations that they needed to act upon in order to optimize the work of their sales force. The overall experience of the sales force was about 15 years plus, and they suggested that the sales force needed to be more consistent in how they went to market, and specifically in trying to gain support in the ongoing transformation to become more customer-centric. So needed to get away from just pushing products and services and become more customer-focused in order to deliver value. And what this particular customer was looking for was they needed to balance a long-term vision with the need to drive incremental business change. They wanted to create global consistency in how they went to market, but at the same time being sensitive to local needs. And then they wanted to achieve these objectives while still minimizing the sales force time away from the field, because obviously we need them to be out there selling. So in a partnered approach, we leveraged the 5 steps I just talked about in the sales conversation module and deployed, customized it to this particular customer, and were able to deploy it to 450 employees through a blended learning approach that included some e-learning training up front before anybody came to a class, 90-minute virtual instructor-led training sessions on each of the different modules that we talked about, or steps in the sales conversations methodology, along with workout sessions. And then there were worksheets for performance support and leader coaching guides, as well as the client-provided sales ambassadors to push out the program. All this content was delivered globally and 100% virtually, and this ensured the minimal time away from the business, which was one of the goals that I mentioned earlier, as well as ensuring consistency alignment across the program. And the results have been outstanding. From a sales benefit perspective, they've been able to increase pipeline opportunities, increase average deal size, increase the number of deals won, and also the size of the wallet share, at the same time being able to decrease the length of their sales cycle. And then from an organizational standpoint, they've been able to adopt and sustain the transformational change that they were recommended to do through the McKinsey report. And this become now a part of their day-to-day sales approach. So that's just one example of the effective use of sales conversations. So in terms of takeaways before we open up the questions, again, buyers want to talk to a sales rep who has a point of view that will help them solve business problems. It all needs to start from the business perspective, and buyers that listen to them. Prepare for your meeting with the buyer, be able to answer questions and be able to listen, and then be able to share customer stories where you've helped solve business problems. And with that, we'll open it up to questions.
Very good. Thanks for a great presentation, Jim. We only have a couple of minutes left here, so just as a reminder, if you have a question, be sure to enter it into the Q&A module at this time. Jim covered a lot in his presentation, and there is still more information to discuss. We encourage you to continue the conversation with Jim beyond today's session. His contact information is available in this slide deck, and we will send everyone a link to the follow-up blog post where he will address some of today's key takeaways. I would also like to remind you that the recording and slides from today will be sent to the email address you provided during registration. So it looks like we have a couple of questions coming in, Jim, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. The first question is, what are some of the things that should be covered in the meeting to call it successful?
Okay, great question. A number of things. I think some that come to mind first is being able to discover value in the meeting, so being able to determine what the customer cares about, validating what you found in your research. Second, being able to position the value, so being able to share with the customer compelling reasons to choose you and your product and service. And I think the third big one would be being able then to deliver that value. What are the compelling outcomes, the deliverables on what to prove to your customer that what matters most to them. There are other things too, like making sure that you've come up with next steps and that they're timely and that they're smart, but those would be some of the main things that you want to accomplish in the meeting.
Very good. In concept number 3, you mentioned a 6-step meeting structure. Could you give us a little bit more information on that? Sure.
So what we have found is part of making sure that the meeting is successful and that you're well organized, besides having the agenda and having the course or having the meeting objectives done up front. The 6 steps that you can go about to making sure the meeting is successful include opening the meeting with your tailored point of view, then being able to catalyze the information you've gleaned ahead of time with the conversation you're beginning to have with the customer. Begin exploring where is there a match for your point of view, their business needs, and the services, goods and services that you supply. Fourth, then being able to sell the vision for your customer as they go to make that buying decision and share that with other stakeholders. 5, being able to provide examples and stories where this has been successful at other places. And then 6, confirming that you have that shared definition of success when you walk out of the meeting.
Great. We're going to take one more question. We're just a couple of minutes over here, so we've got one more question that we'll take here. And again, we'll address all of the other questions in the follow-up blog post. So the last one, Jim, at the beginning you mentioned the increase of social media in the sales process. How much should we as sales professionals focus on building rapport, interacting with prospects online?
I think it's real important. In fact, we've tried to do a lot more of that, ourselves internally. Having a social presence, being out there, on Twitter and in Facebook, and having a LinkedIn profile that not only has, a description, a resume, those resume type things, but samples of work you've done, case studies on customers you've worked with, references and referrals from folks both internally and externally that you work with. So more and more that the first thing I'm finding in buyers that I talk to is the first thing they do is when a meeting's set up, they're going out and they're looking and they're trying to find out everything they can about Jim Patton and his organization before Jim ever gets there.
Very good. All right, I think we'll go ahead and start wrapping things up. Thanks again to today's speaker, Jim Patton, and thanks to everyone who attended for your time and attention. We hope that you'll join us again next week for the webinar with Jim titled, Managing the Creative Team When You Can't Hang Their Work Up on the Fridge. Thanks for your time, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.